This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host. And joining me today is Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Well, thanks for having me, Sam.
It's always our pleasure to host you on your own podcast. I find that it's much more effective that way.
For Richard Blackaby to show up
for
on
his own
podcast.
Yeah, for which it is named. And I would always prefer you be here than to not. And so it would be a pretty lousy podcast if you didn't. So.
I'm thinking the same thing.
So today we are going to do something that we love to do, and that is a book review. And we've done these throughout our podcast, and it's one of my favorite. And I guess I probably say this about all the different things that we do. They're all my favorites.
They're all your favorites, like your kids.
It's like, yeah, exactly. Yeah. You can't pick a favorite child, but they're all up there. And so what book do we have before us today, Richard?
Well, this is a different kind of book, but I think a very practical one. It's a secular book, but it is the book by James Clear called Atomic Habits, an easy and proven way to build good habits and break bad ones. And I think it's just, in fact, our book club is going to be reading this one right now.
It's on my list too.
Because I found it interesting. Now, I think it came out in around 2018, but I think it's sold something like over 10 million copies now in the last several years.
Phenomenally successful. And I'm sure most of our listeners have heard of it, if not already read it.
And it's interesting. I'm also noticing several other podcasters and authors now coming up with books about habits as well. And and they'll cite this one as a very formative book as well. So it's having an impact on leadership thought.
Yeah.
And so so this is all about habits, and he calls it atomic habits because that word atomic really is kind of describing small changes, small habits. He says sometimes the idea of hitting that home run, that one game-winning home run hit, we're all looking for that. Like, what's the one home run hit I can do in my business, my church, my leadership career that will just propel me to greatness? And he says, really, it's a lot more about small changes that just accumulate over time. And his opening illustration has become pretty well known of just the British cycling club that for over 100 years did terrible in the Olympics and World Championships. The French and others, Americans, were killing the field, and it's really between them most of the time. And the British never just did poorly. And so they hire Dave Brailsford, and what he does is he starts working on just small adjustments. It might just be the clothing they wear that's a little better wind resistant, or just little things that maybe help the tires on the bicycles hug the road a little tighter, and just incremental 1% change here, 1% improvement there. But then before long, suddenly they're all adding up, and they're starting to win championships and create a dynasty. And you can't just see one sort of knockout blow that did it. It was just changing the way that they did a number of things. And so these atomic habits, he says, they accumulate over time and help you to be more successful. And so,
which I think is the great insight to the naming of it, atomic.
Yeah.
Because it is tiny changes, but it's also, we know the atomic bomb, which is a very large impact.
Yeah.
And so I kind of like that sort of that play on words there.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It kind of catches your eye. He says a habit is a routine or behavior that is performed regularly and in many cases automatically. He says we all deal with setbacks, but in the long run, the quality of our lives often depends on the quality of our habits. And as I said earlier, he says it is so easy to overestimate the importance of one defining moment and underestimate the value of making small improvements on a daily basis. He says habits are the compound interest of self-improvement. And so, and he says habits often appear to make no difference until you cross a critical threshold and unlock a new level of performance. And so, it's kind of like deciding I'm going to get fit. I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to get fit. And so you do a few things. You buy a better pair of running shoes. You start to like change your morning schedule so you have time to run. And at first it's very painful, and it doesn't seem like you're losing any weight. You're running out of breath before you finish your run. But he says, then you just stick with it. You just keep on making those adjustments. And then one day you go out for a run and you just kill it. And you realize, okay, this is starting to be fun. And you realize you can do this. And a number of little adjustments along the way. And all of a sudden, now you realize, okay, I think this is going to stick. I think I can do this. And so he said, I thought it was interesting, he has a different view on goal setting. So like he would say, for instance, let's say you set a goal, I want to lose 20 pounds. And so that's your goal. And so you try to work towards your goal to lose 20 pounds. But he said there's some things wrong if you're driven by a goal. He says one is winners and losers have the same goals. And so, those who didn't lose 20 pounds, they had a goal of losing 20 pounds too. They just failed at it. And others have a goal to lose 20 pounds and they succeed. And so he says simply having a goal, there's lots of people who failed that had the very same goal. So there must be more than just goal setting that gets you to be successful. And he says achieving a goal is only a momentary change. In other words, okay, so I'm going to, January 1, I'm going to lose 20 pounds. And so maybe you do lose 20 pounds. But then what do you do as soon as you've lost 20 pounds?
Yeah.
You go and have ice cream and celebrate. Yeah. And it doesn't often take long before you've gained the 20 pounds back, because once the goal's achieved, then oftentimes you stop doing what it took because you think, okay, I did it.
You let your foot off the gas. Yeah.
And so it says also goals can restrict your happiness in the sense that, okay, I'm going to just really kill myself here until I get my goal done. And if you fail to reach your goal, then you're unhappy about that. And so he said, if your life is just sort of centered around I'm going to be happy if I achieve my goal, I'm going to be unhappy if I don't. Mm-hmm. Then he said, you're not, it's going to take a while to achieve your goal. So that means that if your joy is tied into your happiness is tied into your achieving a goal, then a lot of your time is going to be spent unhappy. And then then again, just the last one is goals are at odds with long-term progress. And so we always want to kind of let our foot up off the gas once we achieve our goal. But there's a lot more that we could achieve if we, instead of thinking short term, just getting a goal accomplished, we actually change our lifestyle. And so he says there's a better way to do that. And that is, for instance, instead of saying, I'm going to lose 20 pounds, he says what's better is when change is tied into your identity. And he says there's three kinds of change that you can have. He says one is a change of outcomes, and that is a traditional, okay, I want to change my weight so that I'm 20 pounds lighter. And so it's simply an outcome. That's my goal. I'm going to
results focused.
I'm going to be 20 pounds lighter. A second change is a change in process. So, okay, I'm going to stop eating dessert. I'm going to stop eating donuts.
I'm going to stop having joy.
I'm going to stop having joy. Yeah. But with the goal that I've lost weight. But he says what you want to do is you want to tie change into your identity. And so what you want to do is you want to say, I'm not losing 20 pounds just so I'm 20 pounds lighter. What I really want is I want to be a healthy person. I want to be a person. As a healthy person, I'm going to do healthy things. Healthy people eat right. Healthy people exercise. And so if it's not just tied to as soon as I lose the 20 pounds and I'm free and easy again, but if you say no, I'm a healthy person. So as a healthy person, I'm going to naturally do healthy things, and that will more than likely lead to losing some weight. But once I've lost that weight, I'm going to continue acting like a healthy person. And so that's going to mean that I'm going to continue to be healthy, and I might even lose some more weight.
Yeah.
And so he says, real change happens when it's tied to your who you are. And so he says, it says it's hard to change your habits if you never change the underlying beliefs that led to your past behavior. Improvements are only temporary until they become part of who you are. And so he says, your habits are how you embody your identity. And so one thing I do like, he has several things I think that are quite kind of they kind of capture your imagination. And one thing he says I thought was really good is he says, every time you do a desired, like let's say that you want to start running, and maybe you want to try to, get to where you can run 5K a couple times a week. And so, but you haven't been a runner before. And so it's just a burden. And every day you look at, going outside and running and you think, oh, I hate running, but I got to do it. I got to lose this weight. But he says, but every time that you strap on your shoes and you go out and run, he says you're casting a vote that affirms your new identity. So you might say, well, I'm not a runner, but you know what? For the last year, you've run 3 times a week. That makes you a runner. You're a runner. Well, yeah, but I don't see myself as a runner. Well, yeah, but every time you go out and run, you've just cast another vote to say, I'm a runner. Or every time that you pass right by that box of donuts in the company lobby as you're going in, you're voting and saying, I'm a healthy eater. I have healthy habits. Well, I didn't used to, but so he says, when you keep casting a vote for the kind of person that you want to be, every time you do that, you're reinforcing, I guess I am that kind of person.
Yeah.
I am that kind of person that doesn't eat to excess. And so I like that. It said, habits are the path to changing your identity. He says, new identities require new evidence. Quite literally, you become your habits. And he says, as habits are created, the level of activity in the brain decreases. So in other words, in the morning when you're first deciding to go for a run, you're thinking to yourself, do I have it in me today? It looks kind of cold outside. I'm a little sore from sleeping last night. Maybe, and so you have to sort of fight that battle.
Yeah.
Okay, am I going to run today?
Mental energy expended.
Yeah. But he says when it becomes a habit where when your alarm goes off, you throw yourself out of bed, slap on your shoes and your running gear, and you're in motion. He says your brain isn't having to think through all that anymore. Your brain's not having to analyze, well, how cold is it today? And is it raining out? And how do I feel? And do I have time? He says, so your brain has to work a lot less hard to get you to that point anymore, because now it's a habit, and your body just knows what to do every morning when you get up.
Well, and those neural pathways in your brain have sort of been grooved out to do that over time. Like as you've made those decisions over and over, they just become easier because they're less of a decision and it's a habit. And so you're not having to
and people
use
think,
mental capacity.
People think oftentimes, well, I just don't want to be enslaved to my habits. I don't want to just be out of control of my life. I want to be free and spontaneous. But he makes a pretty strong case to say, well, real freedom comes from healthy habits.
Yeah.
Because now you're free. You don't have to spend so much time thinking and battling and talking yourself into doing good stuff. And so, with all that time now, and as you're a more healthy person with healthy routines, you discover you've got more time, you got more energy, more health, a lot of things that free you up actually to be the best version of you now. So he kind of pushes back, and some people just don't like, they don't want to have a bunch of stuff on their calendar that they do, or a bunch of, where they every morning at this time they always get up and they always exercise and so on. But he says that's where real freedom comes from, because otherwise you're just in bondage to basically how you feel every day. And how you feel is going to usually be, I don't feel like running. I don't feel like not eating that donut. And so he says, you're really in bondage then. You're not you think you're free, but you're not. You're enslaved to your basic
Are you going to be
impulses.
enslaved to your feelings or enslaved to your will and your habits.
Yeah.
Like, I think you're going to be enslaved.
Yeah.
Like
So-
one way or the other.
Yeah, so you might as well choose good things to drive you
Yeah.
instead of bad things. And his most of the book is centered around 4 things that he says, if you know, to develop atomic habits. Basically he says there's not necessarily. He says he kind of pushes back from saying there are good habits and bad habits. He says there's just effective habits. What are the habits that are effective in getting what you want? And because he says even bad habits have a function. Like you could be a chain smoker, and you might find that in the short term that relieves. If it's it may be you do it because it relieves stress, and for a while it works. It does accomplish your goal.
Yeah.
It's just that there's a lot of side effects to it. In the long term, it's going to cause other problems, and so you want to find habits that are more effective, that don't have the downside that certain habits have. But he says there's 4 things in particular that you want to do to develop these kind of habits, and one is just make them obvious. And so, that could be anything from like if you want to eat more healthily, we'll put a bowl of fruit in a very obvious place. And make it easy. Put your running shoes right by your bed when you get up in the morning so that you can't miss it.
Set all your clothes out and what you need
Yeah.
the night before.
And make it as easy as possible, as obvious as possible. You can't miss it. It reminds you, it's staring you in the face. If you don't, it's like set your Bible out in the morning for your quiet time. So if you walk right past it, you're consciously choosing, okay, today I'm going to just forfeit that habit that I know I should be doing. And his second thing is, he said, just make it attractive. Don't make it a prison sentence. Figure out how to make it as attractive as possible. So, maybe when you're running, you get a running partner that runs with you, and so that changes everything. I found it's always easier to run with someone. I wimp out far less often when there's someone there with me, and it's just fun to do it with someone else. Maybe it's playing, racquetball or tennis or something with someone else, but find a way. And that doesn't mean that, like I know when my mom was trying to get my dad to go walking, she'd say, well, let's walk to the muffin shop, so he wanted a muffin, but it sort of defeated the purpose. But make the habit, and there's lots of creative ways to do that, and he gives some suggestions there about how to do that as well. It doesn't have to be just drudgery. There's a way to make it fun. And then a third thing is just make it easy. Sometimes people set goals that are just impossible. They're out of reach. You set yourself up to fail. And so do it in a way that makes it easy to follow through. One thing he said I thought was interesting. He says, it's better to do a part of the goal than not to do it at all. And so sometimes we think, well, because I know I've been like that, where it's like, well, I really want to run 5K, but I really don't have 30 minutes to do that today. I've only really got about 15 minutes, so why bother? And he would say, well, it's better to get out there and run even for 15 minutes than not at all.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of it, I think, helpful advice to say, don't set goals that are really hard for you. Like if you say, I want to go work out at the gym, but the gym is on the other side of town, well, it's just not gonna be sustainable. So figure out a way that, whatever the habit is you want to develop, you've got the tools for it, you've got the space for it, and so on. And then last one, make it satisfying. In other words, there's got to be some kind of reward. Just make sure it's a reward that doesn't go counter against what you're trying to do. And so he says, and he calls it a habit stacking too, where you may, if you already have certain habits, like maybe you want to start taking vitamins. And so he would say, well, if you always have breakfast every morning, then put those vitamins right there at the table where you have your breakfast. And so or if you want to have a quiet time, but what is something that you already do habitually already? Well, then stack some other habits with those. Make it all part of the same routine now. So when you sit down at the kitchen table, you you read your Bible, you have breakfast, you take your vitamins. And so he said that's another way to kind of insert habits that stick, is attach them, stack them in other habits that you've already got nailed down, that you know you're going to do. I thought something that was very interesting too. He says a lot about environment. He says environment is the invisible hand that shapes human behavior. He says every habit is context dependent, and I thought it was an interesting discussion. In fact, he said he gives an interesting kind of example of a study that was done, I think around 1970, with soldiers in Vietnam. And when they went over to Vietnam and were kind of investigating the soldiers there, they found that a large percentage, like maybe 15% or so, were addicted to drugs. I think even to like heroin, to heavy duty drugs. And so they were very concerned about all these drug addicted soldiers coming back to America. But what they found, which was quite, in a sense, counterintuitive, was that when the soldiers came back to America, a large percentage of them very quickly got off their drug addiction. And you'd say, well, wait a minute, you're addicted. And heroin is a very addictive drug. So how could you just stop using it? But what they found is they changed their environment. And in Vietnam, when they were facing danger and peril and possible death, that was very conducive to wanting to use drugs. And when a bunch of the other soldiers were all using the drug as well, and it was available, accessible, it was just the environment was very conducive to drug use. But when they came back to America, many of them suddenly weren't with a bunch of other soldiers. They weren't being shot at every day. The drugs might not have been as available. And so for many of them, they discovered that in a different environment that was not conducive to that, they were able to kick their habit. And so he said that kind of speaks a lot of times to like drug rehab centers, because why does the rehab center often work? Well, you get put in an environment where it's very difficult to use drugs. And so you get off your drug habit, but you haven't really lost your addiction. You've just changed your environment. But then you go back to the environment that led to your addiction in the first place, and what happens? You relapse, because all the cues, you're surrounded by cues that are trying to drive you back to the same habits that were destructive. He said the most persistent behaviors usually have multiple cues, and so drug addiction often isn't just one thing. It's a number of things that all point toward a bad habit. And so what he would say is, number one, try to remove those cues. And number two, put positive cues for positive habits. Fill your house with stuff like that. So like, for instance, maybe you're addicted to playing video games and you're playing you spend way too many hours doing that. He said he knows people that like maybe will put the remote control away, unattach it from the controlling device or whatever, the TV, put it in the closet somewhere, or maybe put the entire TV away. And then, if you're going to say, okay, well, I'm going to spend an hour when I get home or after dinner, or at some point you say, okay, I'm going to pull out the controller and I'll play it for an hour. Just the fact that it's not right there makes it easier for you to like not slide back into a bad habit of playing it too much. Or, of course, if you're trying to like eat less snacks, but you've got a pantry filled with snacks, you're in an environment that every time you open that pantry to get, something else out and you see all those snacks, it's like, well, maybe I'll just have one bite, or I've got this cookie jar. I'm trying to eat less cookies, but I've got a cookie jar right there with cookies in it.
I don't want them to go bad.
And I keep walking past it to get a glass of water. And so so he says, you're the architect of your environment. And so if you will fill your environment with cues that drive you to good habits, and you eliminate the cues with bad habits, then he said you're much more likely to be following good habits. And he says something kind of interesting. Which I guess you just kind of have to think about a little bit. But he feels like that. He says one space, one use, and his kind of thought is, as best you can, try to have like designated spaces in your house for one primary purpose. And so So like, for instance, he would say, okay, if you're sitting on your couch in your living room, if that is to watch TV, then don't make it also your kitchen. Like, don't make it where you go get a bag of chips and sit down and now you're eating and recreating at the same time. So like if you're going to eat, maybe eat in the kitchen. And so when you leave the kitchen, you're done eating. And he says the same thing like in your bedroom. He says like people that have trouble sleeping at night. He said, but if you have a TV in your bedroom or you bring your tablet into your bedroom, and so your bedroom's also a place you watch TV. It's a place where you check the internet. It's a place where you do other things. He said, then if you really struggle sometimes to sleep because you've got too many different cues going on. You're thinking, well, I'm not sleeping. I wonder if I should just turn on the TV and see what's on there. So it's an interesting concept. I need to think more about that. But he said sometimes, you might just live in an apartment, but he said it could even just be, okay, when I sit in that chair, that's when I, answer emails and check social media. But once I get up from there, I don't keep checking social media. Here's where I read books, or here's where I eat my food, or and he said, again, it can kind of seem, you kind of think, okay, well, how complicated do I have to make this? But what he's really trying to do, I think, is uncomplicate your life, so that when I'm here, that this is when I exercise, and here's where I rest, and here's where I feed myself. And so he said there's, if you struggle, he says, with being disciplined, he says a lot of times, let's say that you keep on falling off the wagon and eating bad food, but eating poorly. He says, a lot of times we'll say, well, you just have to be more disciplined, just be more disciplined. But he says something interesting. He said, instead, disciplined people are better at structuring their lives in a way that does not require heroic willpower and self-control. The people with the best self-control are typically the ones who need to use it the least. And so he's saying, rather than every day it being a battle of, so like if you eat too many cookies and so you say, I've got to have more self-control. I've got to be able to just stop craving cookies all the time. But you keep cookies in your house,
Yeah.
And so like he would say, well, disciplined people oftentimes are the ones who just don't put it in the house in the first place. It's not available. They've got, apples or carrot sticks, or they've got healthy choices if they're craving something, need to chew on something. And so you'd say, oh, you're way more disciplined. And he would say, well, they have been disciplined enough to create an environment that doesn't require a lot of. If all you got is carrot sticks to eat, you don't have to be real disciplined to not eat cookies. You don't have many other options. And so this whole book just has. Maybe just one last thing to say about that is, he says that, you're of course again to do with environment, but he says that you can create environments that really support the positive habits that you want to practice. And he gives the example of Laszlo Polga, who kind of wanted to do an experiment about this. And so what he did is he ended up having 3 daughters, and he kind of worked this out with his wife, I guess. And they decided that they wanted to create an environment that valued and celebrated chess. And so he had pictures of chess masters on their walls. He had chess sets all over the place. He had books on chess and the masters and some of the great games. And of course, he played chess with his little girls as they were growing up. And ultimately, all 3 girls grew up to be chess masters, grandmasters, world champions, and for women. But when they asked them, like, your whole family, like, you just play chess you grew up in an environment that just loved chess, and they would say, didn't you feel like oppressed? Didn't you feel like that was kind of pushed down your throat? Didn't you feel that you wanted to rebel against that and say, no, I'm going to play checkers instead? And interestingly, they all said, no, but it was what was celebrated. It was what was cherished, and we were surrounded by it. And so we didn't really feel like it was pushed on us. It was like we
felt very natural for them.
Yeah, and we just came to enjoy it and to find pleasure in it. And so our dad didn't have to demand. All right, before you can have dinner, you got to play your daily chess game. It was more like, Dad, before we eat, can we just finish our game first? And so I thought a lot about that when it comes to like discipleship and church. And maybe as you're raising your kids, how do you create an environment where it's not really that you're pushing it on your kids as much as you create an environment where certain things are celebrated, that they're affirmed. And, like I just think about, like, as you've seen, I celebrate books. I like books, I like reading. And so lo and behold, all three of my kids have libraries. They all are readers. We have book club. Our kids grew up seeing books on shelves. They saw their parents reading books. We had a deal with our kids. If you read it, we will buy it for you. Just, whatever book you want, we'll buy it. And when you've read it, let us know. We'll buy you another one. And so I took my kids to used bookstores and got all excited about, treasures we found in the stacks. And so because of that, lo and behold, they all love books. They're all readers and thinkers. And so I think there's a lot of application to the church, to discipleship as well, just looking at these habits. And certainly I think for all of us, as I read this, I just thought, okay, so what are some habits, if I really develop this, that I would, I'd be a healthier person, more successful at certain things. And the last thing he says is the greatest threat to success is not failure, but boredom. And so he would say that, once you have a habit and you've been doing it for a while, after you've been running, every morning for 5 years, he says, that at that point, your biggest battle is going to be boredom. It's like, I've done this for so long now that I'm kind of tired of just doing the same thing all the time. And so he has a few ideas about how to maybe change it up or push yourself. He says you got to find some way to maybe stretch yourself. If it's too easy, then you start getting bored with it.
Yeah.
And so you need in some way to always be pushing yourself a little further, or find some new dimension that changes it up somehow. But it certainly was a very. I can see why it's sold so many copies. And of course, he's not a Christian, so this particular book is going to use science and human reasoning. I think you have to kind of baptize this writing to think from a Christian perspective. He doesn't talk about the role of the Holy Spirit as well in helping you to break out of some bad habits and to fashion some new ones. But I think there is some real practical advice, and I think just the concept of habits themselves, for a Christian, I think, where you get some godly habits in place where you don't have to agonize about it, debate about it. You just get up and you just do it. I think is a good word for all of us, and so we'll see what everyone comes up with when we discuss it in the next book club.
For sure. Well, I'm looking forward to finishing it, and as always, we'll leave links to this book in our show notes, and let us know what you think. If you've read this or if you plan on reading it, we'd love to hear from our listeners and just a word or two about how you found this book, and if it's changed any of your habits or the way that you organize your life. And until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.